All right. Well, welcome back. We're going to jump in and talk a little bit today. What I want to do in this video is talk a little bit about the measurements and the different components of GDP. And what we're going to do is we're going to define what GDP is. We're going to talk about what affects GDP, what doesn't affect GDP. And yeah, and we'll just jump in. So, what is GDP? Well, first of all, GDP. What the heck? Not working. So GDP stands for gross domestic product, and you don't necessarily need to know that per se, but I believe it does help you kind of recognize what GDP is, and especially how it differs from like CPI, for example, which is Consumer Price Index. So GDP, you'll often see GDP reflected as the variable Y. And what it is it is a combination of these four things, I should say. So this one is its consumption. This one is investment, or I totally spelled that wrong. Investment/inventory. Okay, and then we have this is like government spending. And then finally, we have NX, which stands for net exports. So basically what that is, let me zoom out so you can see it a little bit better. So what this is really is it's your exports minus imports. Okay, so if you're importing something, it's going to have a negative effect on GDP. If you're exporting something, it'll have a positive effect, which makes sense. What GDP is it's really just a measurement it's a measurement tool to see how well off a country is doing, and among other things. It's not perfect, as you can probably already see some caveats in it, but it doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be consistent. I would say it's easy to argue that our current system for like measuring distance, like for example miles, the standard system, I wouldn't say that's perfect, but it doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be consistent. As long as everyone understands it, that's all that matters. So this is GDP. So what wouldn't get counted into GDP? Well, first of all, it's important to know that GDP is usually the final goods and service that we're offering. So, for example, we wouldn't count intermediate goods. So if I use flour to bake a bread, for example, I wouldn't count the sale, me buying the flour and then selling the bread, because then I'm double counting GDP. I would only count the sale of the bread, because that's accounting for the flour, it's accounting for the labor that's happening, it's accounting for a lot of these things, and it's kind of reflected all in one in that sale of that individual loaf of bread. So we want to avoid double counting, especially like used cars and other things. Like we don't necessarily need to double count it if we're reselling something. Also, it has to be a good or service that's being sold. If I go home and I make myself ramen to eat for myself, that wouldn't get counted because I'm not offering that as a service. It's not necessarily on the market, I would say. Now, this could be confusing because oftentimes people don't count things like investment and inventory. So to illustrate this better, let's talk about what is counted. So let's say anything that's produced in that year. So for example, okay, let's say I produce, I don't know, like 100 there's a cactus right next to me that I'm looking at. Let's say 100 computers, okay, and I sell, I don't know, 50 of those computers to U.S. consumers. And the other 50 I sell next year. Does that mean, so what happens to the overall GDP? Okay, let's illustrate this. So I sell C plus I plus G plus NX. So I sell 50 computers. I think that's pretty easy. I make and sell, make 100 computers in 2016. And we're looking for what's happening to the GDP in 2016. So I think it's pretty easy to see that when we sell 50 of the computers to U.S. consumers in 2016, so consumption is going to go up by 50. But the next other 50 doesn't get sold to consumers until 2017. So some people might think, okay, well, that one's going to get counted into 2017 GDP. That's actually not true. We're producing the computers, and because we're creating something that year, it needs to get counted in 2016 GDP. But where that's getting put is in the inventory. We're storing it to be sold in 2017. So that extra 50 million would go right here. Okay, and altogether we have an increase of 100 computers, I should say. So 50 computers here, 50 computers in inventory to be sold the next year, and then we have 100 computers. Now, let's say what happens in 2017. Does that mean we have it gets double counted, that the 50 gets added here? So it does get added in consumption because we're selling it to U.S. consumers, but where are we selling it from? From our inventory. We're not producing new computers, so it actually has no effect on overall GDP. It's just the components get moved because we're losing the 50 computers from inventory and it's getting transferred to consumption, which is being added here, and so there is no effect to overall GDP in 2017. Okay, hopefully this is starting to make a little bit of sense. To better illustrate it, let's look at some practice problems, okay? Try to make this so you can see it. Okay, so the following question says, which of the following transactions will increase U.S. GDP? Goodyear Tires in the U.S. sends 30 million of tires to Japan, where they are placed on new Lexus cars, then sold to the U.S. for 400 or 500 million. Stop. Think. Before I give you the answer, what do you think this is? Do you think this affects GDP? Do you think is this a final good and service? Well, the Lexus car, the aspect of the Lexus cars being sold, let's see here. The aspect of the Lexus cars being sold in the U.S. for 500 million will affect GDP. Okay. It will be because you're selling it to Japan. So Japan is selling it to the U.S., so that's an import. Okay. Will that affect overall U.S. GDP? Well, let's think about it. So I'll tell you right now, imports do not affect overall GDP. Now, why is that the case? So if we have our Y, this is GDP with C plus I plus G plus NX. Okay, so we're importing these 500 million cars. So you might be thinking, well, that's going to decrease. But who are we selling it to? Well, we sell cars typically to consumers. So that means it's going to increase consumption by 500 as well because the U.S. consumers are buying the cars. So these would cancel out. So anytime we're importing a good, they're going to cancel out, so it's going to have no effect to overall GDP. Now you might ask the next question, well, what about the 30 million we're exporting in tires to Japan? Well, this 30 million is an intermediate good because as such, we're not going to reflect it. So this will not affect U.S. GDP. Now let's look at B. U.S. individuals reduce their cooking at home, switching to eat similar meals at local restaurants. Yes, that does affect U.S. GDP. Why? Well, because we're transitioning from a non-good and service to buying a service at a local restaurant. That's generating something new and helping. So yes, that would work. And then finally, Ford in the U.S. sells 50 million of cars to consumers in Canada because that is an export that will get counted to U.S. GDP. So you add 50, so that one gets counted. Okay, so the answer here would be B and C. Okay, let's look at another question. Suppose Dodge builds 40 million of the Charger vehicles in 2017, but they remain unsold. In 2018, they are purchased for 35 million by police departments as cop cars because of these transactions. Okay, so now we're looking at the components of GDP. So what's happening in 2017? They're creating 40 million Chargers. That should give you a good indicator of where we're going. So what's happening to overall GDP? Well, because we're creating something, it's adding 40 million. But where specifically in the components of GDP is that getting the 40 million get adding? Well, it's not being sold to consumers. It is being stored, so it could be like investment or inventory. So we'll add that 40 million because it will be sold the previous year in 2018. So that's everything for 2017. And then what's happening in 2018? Well, we're selling that 40 million to the government because police, that's government. So we're adding 40 million to government and subtracting the 40 million from investment, moving it from inventory to government spending. Okay, so looking at the answer choices, I guess it's 35 million. Let me be clear. Sorry, it's not the 40 million. So we're selling 35 million, so there's still 5 million left in inventory, and adding 35 million to government spending in 2018. Okay, let's look at the answer choices. Government will be higher by 35 million higher in 2018. That's correct. Investment will be 35 million lower in 2018. That is also correct. GDP will be 40 million higher in 2017. That is also correct. So I would put all A, B, and C. Okay, hopefully this makes sense. Let me know if you have any questions. Adam out.